I never thought a routine physical would be the thing that saved my life. But when Dr. Patricia Huang looked up from her computer screen during what should have been a 40-minute annual checkup and asked me a question I didn't understand, everything I believed about my marriage began to collapse in real time. My name is James Whitfield. I'm 64 years old, a retired high school principal from Columbus, Ohio, and until that Thursday morning in November, I was convinced I was one of the lucky ones. A man who had survived grief, found love a second time, and was building something worth living for. I had been wrong before. Never quite like that. My first wife, Carol, died 4 years before I met Sandra. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. 31 years of marriage ended so quickly it felt like a door slamming shut in a quiet house. I went through the first year on autopilot, the second year with the help of a grief counselor, and the third year just barely holding the shape of the person I used to be. My daughter Emily, who lived in Austin and worked as a hospital administrator, called every Sunday without fail. She was the reason I got out of bed some mornings. She was the reason I eventually agreed to attend the grief support group at the community center in Worthington. That's where I met Sandra. She was 53 when we met, soft-spoken and composed in a way that felt like still water. She had long brown hair, going gray at the temples, and the kind of attentive eyes that made you feel genuinely heard. She told the group she had lost her husband 2 years earlier to a sudden heart attack. She'd been a bookkeeper in Cincinnati before moving to Columbus to be closer to her sister. She said she was still learning how to build a life alone. When she laughed at something, the group facilitator said, "I noticed it for the first time in a long time." Not the laugh itself, but the fact that I noticed it. We started having coffee after the group meetings. Coffee became dinners. Dinners became long Sunday drives through the countryside east of the city. By the time Emily flew up from Austin for her spring visit, Sandra and I had been seeing each other for 5 months, and I was already thinking about the future. Emily met Sandra over dinner at a restaurant downtown. She was polite, careful in the way she'd always been when she was thinking something she hadn't decided to say yet. "She seems warm," Emily told me the next morning over breakfast at my kitchen table. Her hands were wrapped around her coffee mug, and she was looking out the window into the backyard. "She is," I said. "She really is, Dad." She set the mug down. "Don't you think it's a little soon?" "It's been 3 years. 3 years feels like a long time when you're living alone." "I know. I just want you to be sure." She looked at me directly then with those clear brown eyes that were exactly her mother's. "You're not doing this because you miss Mom, right? Because that's different from actually knowing this woman." I told her she was being overprotective. I told her Carol would have wanted me to be happy. Emily nodded slowly and didn't push further, but before her Uber arrived to take her to the airport, she put her hand on my arm and said, "Just take your time, okay? You don't have to rush." I proposed to Sandra 8 months later. We were married the following spring in a small ceremony at a botanical garden outside the city. Emily stood beside me, smiled through the whole ceremony, and hugged Sandra with what I chose to interpret as genuine warmth. Looking back now, I understand that Emily had already started paying close attention. She just didn't say it. The first year of marriage to Sandra was good, genuinely good. She moved into the house in Worthington that Carol and I had bought 28 years earlier, and she was thoughtful about the transition in the way I hadn't expected. She didn't try to erase Carol's presence. She let me keep the photographs on the mantel, let me keep the garden Carol had planted in the backyard. She found her own corners of the house to inhabit, her reading chair in the study, her herbs growing in pots along the kitchen windowsill. It felt like a careful and considerate negotiation, and I was grateful for it. Sandra's bookkeeping work was freelance, which meant irregular hours and occasional evening calls with clients. I didn't mind. I understood professional obligations. In the evenings, we'd sit on the back porch and she'd bring me chamomile tea and we'd watch the fireflies come up in the yard the way Carol and I used to. There were moments when the grief and the gratitude overlapped in ways I couldn't fully separate, and I decided that was all right. About 16 months into our marriage, I started waking up at night with a slow, heavy feeling in my chest. Not pain, exactly. More like pressure. Like something pressing gently but persistently against my ribs. My heart rate seemed uneven some mornings. A fluttery irregularity I chalked up to too much coffee. I felt tired in a way that wasn't fixed by sleep. My ankles swelled sometimes by the end of the day. I mentioned it to Sandra. She was immediately concerned, attentive in that careful way of hers. She brought me herbal supplements she ordered online. Something for circulation, something for heart support, something for energy. She researched cardiac health and printed articles she thought I should read. She accompanied me to my appointments with my regular internist, Dr. Morrison, and asked thoughtful questions while I sat on the examination table. Dr. Morrison ran an EKG, listened to my heart, checked my blood pressure, and said the things doctors say to men in their early 60s who sit too much and worry too easily. Reduce stress, walk more, cut back on sodium. I followed his advice. The symptoms would ease for a while, and then return. Sandra started making me a morning drink each day, a warm combination of apple cider vinegar, honey, ginger, and a blend of supplement powders she kept in small, unlabeled jars on the kitchen counter. It tasted medicinal and sharp. She said a client of hers had reversed early heart disease with a similar protocol. I drank it every morning because she handed it to me, and she was trying to help me, and that is what you believe about the person you've married. By the time November came around, 2.5 years into our marriage, I had lost 12 pounds, felt perpetually exhausted, and had begun experiencing occasional blurring at the edges of my vision. My coordination wasn't right. I would miscalculate the distance to a door frame and clip my shoulder passing through. Some days I felt nauseated by mid-afternoon without any clear reason. My annual cardiology appointment was already scheduled. Dr. Patricia Huang had been monitoring a minor arrhythmia I'd had since my 50s. It had always been manageable and unremarkable. I expected the appointment to be unremarkable too. I sat in the examination chair while she reviewed the blood work I'd had drawn 2 days earlier. She was quiet for longer than usual. I watched her scroll through something on the screen. Stop, scroll back, look at something again. Her expression was professionally controlled, but something had shifted in it. James, she said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. I told her to go ahead. Are you taking any heart medications I don't know about? Anything outside what I've prescribed? I wasn't. She knew everything I took. A low-dose aspirin, a statin, the supplements Sandra ordered, though I hadn't mentioned those specifically because I hadn't thought they were relevant. What supplements? I described them. The morning drink, the powders in the unlabeled jars. Dr. Huang was quiet for a moment. Your blood work shows an elevated level of digoxin, she said. Digoxin is a prescription cardiac medication, a very specific one. I have never prescribed it to you. In the right dose, it can regulate certain heart rhythms, but in doses above a therapeutic range, taken by someone who doesn't need it, it causes exactly the symptoms you've been describing. The fatigue, the visual disturbances, the arrhythmia, the gastrointestinal problems, nausea. I heard the words. I understood them individually. Together, they didn't yet form a shape I was willing to accept. You're saying I've been accidentally taking someone else's medication? I'm saying digoxin is in your system and I didn't put it there. She held my gaze. James, I need to ask you directly. Is there any possibility that someone could be introducing this medication to you without your knowledge? The question landed somewhere in the center of my chest, which was already struggling. I drove home slowly. Sandra's car was in the driveway. She had mentioned a client call that afternoon. I sat outside in my car for several minutes before going in. She was in the study when I came through the door, on the phone, speaking quietly. She looked up and smiled when she saw me and held up one finger. I nodded and went upstairs. I stood in our bathroom for a long moment looking at the medicine cabinet. My medications were on the left shelf, hers on the right. Her shelf held the usual things: vitamins, ibuprofen, allergy tablets. I looked more carefully. Behind a tall bottle of magnesium, pushed to the very back, there was a small amber prescription bottle I had never seen before. I picked it up carefully by the edge. The label had Sandra's name on it. It was for digoxin, prescribed by a physician whose name I didn't recognize, from a pharmacy in Dayton I'd never heard of. The prescription was 8 months old. It was nearly empty. I put it back exactly as I'd found it and went downstairs and sat in the kitchen and looked at the countertop where Sandra's jars of supplement powder stood in a row on the shelf above the stove. Sandra came in 20 minutes later, her phone call finished. She asked how the appointment went. I told her it was routine. She made dinner while I sat at the kitchen island, watching her move through the space she had made hers. The herbs in the window, the arrangement of cutting boards she'd organized by size, the way she hummed very quietly to herself when she was concentrating. After dinner, I said I was tired and went to bed early. I waited until I heard the television come on downstairs. Then I called Emily. She picked up on the second ring. Dad, you okay? I told her what Dr. Huang had found. I told her about the prescription bottle. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Dad," Emily said finally, and her voice had gone very controlled in the way it does when she's frightened and trying not to show it. "That morning drink she makes you, I know. When did you start drinking it?" I thought back. About 14 months ago, around the time my symptoms first worsened. "Dad, stop drinking it. Tomorrow morning, pour it out when she's not looking. Don't tell her anything. Emily, please. I know how this sounds. Just do it. If I'm wrong, nothing happens. If I'm right," she didn't finish the sentence. I poured the morning drink into the kitchen sink the next day while Sandra was in the shower, rinsing the glass immediately after. I told her when she came down that my stomach was bothering me and I wasn't up for it that morning. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read, then said she hoped I felt better and made herself toast. 4 days later, the pressure in my chest was lighter. A week after that, I felt clearer than I had in over a year. Still exhausted, still not right, but a version of myself I recognized more than the version I'd been living in. The fog that had settled over my thoughts had begun to lift at the edges. On the 8th day, I drove to a medical clinic in Dublin, a suburb I had no connection to, and told the physician there everything. She ordered an immediate comprehensive blood panel, including a specific digoxin level test. She told me to come back in 2 days. I came back in 2 days. She met me in a private exam room with the door closed. Chronic, low-dose digoxin toxicity, consistent with prolonged exposure over 12 to 16 months, not a single large dose. Small amounts, steady and accumulating, the kind of thing that mimics natural cardiac decline in a man of my age and history, and would not have been identified without someone specifically looking for it. "Mr. Whitfield," she said carefully, "this is something I'm required to report. But I want to make sure you understand what this means." "Tell me what to do," I said. My voice was steadier than my hands. I called Emily from the parking lot. She was already booked on a flight to Columbus for the following morning. She had been waiting for this call. "I'm coming," she said. "Don't eat or drink anything she gives you. If you can, stay somewhere else. I can't just leave without a reason. Make one up. Tell her your brother needs you. Tell her anything." I didn't leave that night. Instead, I stayed. And because I had nothing to do but wait and think, I did something I had refused to let myself do for 2.5 years. I went through Sandra's filing box in the closet of the study. She kept her personal papers in a locked expanding file. I had never asked to open it, and she had never offered. I found a small key on a hook behind the bookshelves where we kept the board games. I don't know why I knew to look there. Sometimes the part of your brain that has been protecting you from knowledge you aren't ready to have will finally let it through. The file held more than I expected. There were financial statements I had never seen, a life insurance policy with my name on it, dated 14 months ago. I had not signed that document. The signature looked almost like mine. The policy amount was $1.8 million. The sole beneficiary was Sandra. There were bank statements from an account in her name alone. Monthly deposits that didn't correspond to any freelance bookkeeping work she'd described. There were receipts from a storage facility in a town 40 minutes east of Columbus that I had no reason to have ever visited. And there was a manila envelope, sealed, with a name written on the outside in handwriting that wasn't Sandra's. The name was Ray. I photographed every page with my phone and put everything back in order and locked the box and replaced the key and sat in the dark study for a long time. Emily arrived the next morning while Sandra was out at what she said was a grocery run. She walked through the door and hugged me tightly and then sat across from me at the kitchen table and went through the photographs, one by one on my phone without speaking. "Ray," she said finally. "I don't know anyone named Ray." "Dad." She looked up. "Did Sandra ever mention children? From before?" She hadn't. She had told me she and her late husband had not been able to have children. She'd told me it was something she had made her peace with. Emily was already searching on her laptop. It took her less than 20 minutes to find him. Ray Kowalski, 31 years old. A freelance contractor listed at an address in Akron. The last name Kowalski was the same as Sandra's last name before she'd married her first husband, the one she said had died of a heart attack. When I looked up the obituary of that husband, a man named Gerald Kowalski of Cincinnati, I found that he had died at 61, heart failure. The obituary listed Sandra as his surviving spouse, and Ray as his surviving stepson. Gerald Kowalski had died 4 years before Sandra came to Columbus. He had died of heart failure. He had been 61 years old and apparently in reasonable health until he wasn't. Emily called the Columbus Police Department's non-emergency line from my living room, with her voice perfectly composed, the hospital administrator voice that didn't shake. The detectives arrived within 2 hours. 2 of them, a woman in her early 50s named Detective Karen Solis, and her partner, a younger man named Detective Marcus Webb. I laid out everything on the kitchen table: the blood test results, the photographs of the insurance documents, the prescription bottle I had photographed without touching again, the phone I'd used to photograph the file. Detective Solis listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at her partner briefly and then looked back at me. "Mr. Whitfield, did your wife ever mention her previous last name, before Kowalski?" I said no. She wrote something in her notebook. "We're going to need to ask you to stay somewhere else tonight. Is there somewhere you can go?" Emily and I checked into a hotel downtown. A police officer came to the lobby to take a statement from Emily about the timeline of events. Detective Solis called me that evening to tell me they were seeking a search warrant for the house and the storage facility. The search happened the next morning. Emily and I sat in the hotel and waited. I ate the worst continental breakfast of my life and watched the news without seeing it. Detective Solis called at 11. "Mr. Whitfield, the powder in the supplement jar is on your kitchen shelf. We've sent it to the lab, but preliminary field testing shows the presence of digoxin compound. We also found communications on Sandra's laptop between her and Ray Kowalski going back 18 months. I need you to be prepared for what I'm going to tell you next." I told her I was prepared. I was not. The storage facility held documents going back further than our marriage. A second identity, a name Sandra had used in Indiana before moving to Cincinnati. Medical records from 2 different hospitals in 2 different cities for a man named Gerald Kowalski, cross-referenced with an insurance policy payout of $1.2 million following Gerald's death. The timeline, as Detective Solis laid it out for me over the phone while Emily sat beside me gripping my hand, suggested that what had been certified as heart failure might have been something else entirely. Ray Kowalski had been helping Sandra manage the insurance paperwork for Gerald's death. He had been helping her with mine as well. The communications on her laptop were methodical, transactional, clinical. They discussed dosage. They discussed timing. They discussed what a natural death of an older man with a documented cardiac history would look like, and how long after it occurred one should wait before accessing the policy. The word they used for me in those messages was the account. Sandra was arrested at her sister's house in Dublin that afternoon, where she had gone after the detectives had come to search ours. Emily and I watched the local news that evening and saw the footage outside the sister's house. Sandra came out in a coat I recognized, the blue one with the brass buttons. She didn't struggle. She didn't look toward the cameras. Ray was arrested at his apartment in Akron the following morning. I sat in the hotel room after the news segment ended and looked at the wall for a long time. Emily sat beside me and didn't try to fill the silence with anything, which was the right thing to do. The investigation that followed was more thorough than I had imagined possible. Detectives in Cincinnati requested Gerald Kowalski's remains be exhumed for a toxicology re-examination. The results came back 14 weeks later and showed traces of cardiac glycoside toxicity consistent with chronic digoxin exposure. The death had not been natural. The manner had been undetectable without specific testing because Gerald had a documented history of cardiac problems. The same reason I had been chosen. Sandra's legal name, the investigators discovered, had been changed twice. Before she was Sandra Kowalski, she had been Sandra Merritt. Before that, she was Denise Farber, a name attached to a fraud case in Louisville that had been filed but never prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. The evidence had been insufficient because the victim, an older widower, had died before completing his statement. Emily and I sat through all of this together. She had extended her leave from her hospital job in Austin and didn't tell me until after the fact. She sat through every meeting with detectives, every consultation with the district attorney's office, every procedural update that arrived by phone or by letter. She made sure I understood what was happening and what was coming and what my rights were in each phase. I recovered physically before I recovered anything else. The cardiac symptoms resolved over 4 months as the digoxin cleared my system. The fatigue lingered longer. Dr. Huang monitored my blood work every 6 weeks. She told me at the 3-month mark that there was no permanent damage to my heart, which was a sentence I absorbed sitting in her office with a feeling I couldn't name for several seconds. No permanent damage. Not this time. The trial began 9 months after the arrest. Sandra entered the courtroom in a dark blazer and sat at the defense table with an expression I recognized from our years together, measured, composed, giving nothing away. I had once read attentiveness into that face. I had once found stillness there. Ray had accepted a plea deal and testified for the prosecution. He described the plan in specific terms: the research into undetectable cardiac medications, the method of introducing the compound through a daily drink the target would accept because it came from someone he trusted, the insurance policy forged with a digital copy of my signature, extracted from our marriage license. He used the word target throughout his testimony. He never looked at Sandra while he spoke. The forensic toxicologist explained to the jury how digoxin toxicity progresses, how it mimics natural aging, how it would have been attributed to cardiac failure in a 64-year-old man with an existing arrhythmia. Dr. Huang testified about what she had found in my blood work and why it had prompted her question that November morning. Her testimony was precise and unhurried. Without that question, I would not have been in that courtroom. I would not have been anywhere. Emily testified about the phone call in which I had described the prescription bottle. She was direct and clear and didn't look at Sandra once. I watched Sandra's face when Emily spoke. There was nothing in it. That absence told me more than any expression could have. The defense argued that Sandra had mental health vulnerabilities that predated the marriage, that Ray had been the architect, and she had been a participant who lacked full understanding of the plan's scope. The jury did not believe it. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, fraud, identity fraud. A separate charge related to Gerald Kowalski's death was filed in Cincinnati and would be handled separately. The judge sentenced her to 22 years. Ray received 9 years as a consequence of his cooperation. When the verdict was read, I felt something I had not expected, not relief, not satisfaction, but a deep, exhausted sadness that settled over me like weather. 7 years of my life, 3 of them married to someone whose actual name I had not known, whose history I had never been allowed to see, who had looked at me in a grief support group and seen not a person but a profile, a financially stable widower, a documented cardiac condition, a daughter who lived 1,200 miles away. I understood later that I had been selected, that the grief support group had not been a place Sandra attended for her own healing, but a place she visited looking for men who fit certain criteria: older, financially secure, socially isolated, lonely enough to move quickly. I fit every criterion. I had walked through that door and handed her exactly what she needed. The hardest part of the recovery wasn't physical. It was learning to inhabit my own perceptions again after years of having them quietly redirected. Sandra had been masterful at that particular form of subtle manipulation, the thing therapists call gaslighting, where your own experience of reality is gently and consistently questioned until you stop trusting it. When I had mentioned symptoms, she had translated them into evidence of aging, into reasons I needed more supplements, into confirmation that I was declining and should be grateful to have someone managing my care. She had positioned herself between me and my own judgment so carefully that I hadn't noticed the position she was in. I found a therapist in Columbus, a woman named Dr. Angela Moore, who specialized in trauma and relationship abuse. I went every week for the first year. I told her things I hadn't said to Emily, or to the detectives, or to anyone. The way I had felt sitting in the hotel room, watching the news. The way something in me had known before I was ready to know. The way I had dismissed my daughter's early concern because accepting it would have meant accepting that I was someone who could be fooled. You weren't fooled because you were weak, Dr. Moore said during one of those sessions. You were targeted because you were vulnerable at a specific moment in your life. Those are not the same thing. I wrote that down. I still have it. Emily came back to Columbus several times in the year after the trial. She eventually transferred to a hospital position in Cleveland, 2 hours north, close enough to visit on weekends. She said it was a career opportunity. She didn't say anything about the fact that it put her within driving distance of me. I didn't make her say it. We rebuilt something in those months that had always been there, but was now different, deeper in the way things become when they have been tested. She would come on Saturday mornings, and we would sit in the kitchen with coffee and the newspaper and not talk much. And the quiet between us was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. I eventually went back to the grief support group. Not the same one, a different one, at a different community center. I went because I wanted to understand better and because I thought perhaps my story could be useful to someone. The first time I told it, I was careful, leaving out the names, keeping the details that mattered. An older woman in the group named Florence listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How did you finally know to look?" I thought about it. "My doctor asked me a question I wasn't expecting," I said. And instead of giving her the answer that kept things comfortable, I actually thought about it. Florence nodded. "That's usually how it works," she said. "Someone outside the situation asks the question the person inside has been afraid to ask themselves." I have thought about that often since. There are things I tell people now when the topic comes up, the warning signs I missed and wish I had caught earlier. The way Sandra had gradually narrowed my social world. No dramatic break with friends or family. Just a slow deprioritization of other connections until she was my primary relationship in every direction. The way she had taken over the management of our household finances within the first 6 months of marriage, framing it as helpfulness. The way my symptoms had arrived at such a convenient time for her, and had been so neatly folded into her narrative about my declining health. The way she had been most attentive, most loving, most solicitous, precisely when I had begun to show the first signs of independent thought. Predators like Sandra are patient. They don't rush. They build scaffolding carefully over months and years, and by the time the weight of the structure is bearing down on you, you've stopped remembering what it felt like to stand upright on your own. They choose people in transition, because transition is when defenses are lowest, and the hunger for connection is highest. They target loneliness, not because lonely people are stupid, but because loneliness is a condition that makes anyone willing to trust more quickly than they might otherwise. I say this not to frighten anyone, but because it helped me to hear it framed this way. What happened to me was not a reflection of some fundamental weakness. It was a crime committed by someone skilled in committing it. I'm 64 years old, and I live alone now in a smaller house on the east side of Columbus, close enough to a park that I can walk to it in the morning. The garden from the old house didn't survive the sale, but I have started a small one here, nothing elaborate. Tomatoes, and a few herbs, and the same variety of rosebush Carol used to grow at the other place, because some things deserve to be carried forward. I walk every morning. I have coffee with a neighbor named Harold, who is 70, and opinionated about baseball, and asks nothing of me except that I show up. I see Doctor, more every 2 weeks now, instead of every week, which she tells me is progress. I call Emily every Sunday, and sometimes she calls me first. The settlement from the fraudulent insurance policy, which had been financed partly with money moved illegally from accounts in my name, was fully recovered and returned after the trial. I donated a portion of it to a nonprofit that provides legal advocacy to older adults who are victims of financial abuse. I don't know if that gesture means anything in any measurable sense. It meant something to me. I think about Dr. Huang sometimes. That moment when she looked up from the blood work and asked me a question she was required by medical ethics to ask, and I was required by my own survival to take seriously. A routine checkup, a number on a screen, a physician who paid attention, and didn't stay quiet when staying quiet would have been easier. I think about Emily's voice on the phone that first night, controlled and frightened underneath the control, telling me to pour out the morning drink. I think about how I almost didn't listen, how I had been trained over those years to gently dismiss her concern as overprotectiveness, to reframe it as evidence that she worried too much rather than evidence that she was seeing something I was refusing to see. She worried because she loved me. That worry was precise and correct, and it saved my life in the most literal possible sense. I'm still here. That is not a small thing. On the mornings when I walk to the park and watch the light come through the trees above the path, I understand it as a fact with weight. I am here, and I have my mind, and my body is healing, and my daughter calls on Sunday, and Harold has opinions about the designated hitter rule that I have heard 14 times and still find myself listening to. There is a version of this story that ends differently. I am aware of that version. I think about it on the nights when sleep is slow in coming, when I lie in the dark and hear my own heartbeat steady and uninterrupted, and feel something that is almost gratitude. Not quite, but approaching it. Some chapters end because you finally ask the question you have been afraid to ask. Some of them end because someone who loves you asks it for you. Either way, the asking is the thing. The asking is always the thing.